and so we'll get into it. So today we're going to talk just a quick review of the federal process for our program, the roles and responsibilities of our local sponsors, and then the council's active program management rules. And so really the reason we're here when it comes to federal funding, there's no such thing as free money. There are strings attached and there's processes involved. And so we want to make sure everybody's on the same page as we move into our new program that was just adopted. So as part of the new process that was adopted, the Council of Mayors Executive Committee in the City of Chicago signed an agreement to use a uniform active program management system for both the shared fund and the local programs. There's a number of things up here, deadlines for projects to be initiated, deadlines for projects to be obligated, grace periods for reprogramming, policies for project and phase eligibility, and what we do with re-obligating or redistributing unobligated funds. And so we're going to talk through those things today. Really, there's four main components of active program management. The first one is what we've just gone through for the last basically year, since January of this year, the program development, which was the call for projects, scoring and ranking all of our projects, and then building our new program. And now we're into project management and program management, all of the individual projects, as well as there's some additional provisions that we'll get into as well. So first thing to remember with the federal process, there are lots of folks involved in your projects, PLs, CMAP staff, IDOT Central Office, Federal Highways, and then local agency staff as well, if you have a consultant. So everybody has a role in the process. And so we're going to talk through a little bit about those roles. Really, you know, when we look at our program, the role of the planning liaison is trying to balance how all the different agencies involved in the process track it versus what is the project's real schedule. So CMAP has their TIP database. IDOT has a database that they use their PPI forms to update. We have our council program, and then there's reality. And really the goal is to have the three main databases match project schedules reality, so that funding is available when it's needed. So there are certain things that we have, tools that we use to maintain that balance. We're going to get into the quarterly updates. We've been doing that for the last 3 years, and that will continue. We do TIP amendments and TIP modifications to keep CMAP's TIP database up to date to make sure that the federal highways can authorize funds. We use PPI forms to make sure that IDOT's database is up to date. And then planning liaisons, myself and Joe, also review funding agreements to make sure that all of the databases and everything matches. But really, the most important thing throughout all of this is communication. When things change with your project, we need to know so that we can make sure that when your project is ready to go, when you need the funding, it is there for you. So please always make sure that you're letting us know when things change with your project. So to talk a little bit about the first part of active program management, individual project management, and then a little bit later, we'll get into the entire program of projects. So first and foremost, local agencies are asked to designate project managers. A technical manager would be the staff responsible for implementing the project. Financial manager would be staff that is responsible for ensuring that the local match is in the budget. Depending on the community, that may be the same person. Other communities, it may be different. There could be a consultant involved. And so as part of the award letter that we sent out, we did include a project manager designation form. I'm starting to get those back in. If you haven't submitted those, please do get those back to me. And if someone changes, if staff changes or whoever the project manager is changes, please make sure you keep that up to date as we get into the quarterly updates. That will be important, as the quarterly updates need to be submitted from one of those either technical or financial project managers. That's part of the regionally agreed upon active program management rules. So another item for local agencies to keep in mind: if you're using federal funds for engineering, you need to follow a qualifications-based selection process. You have to have an adopted process that follows Bureau of Local Roads and Streets, Chapter 5. You can advertise for multiple phases, but that has to be in the advertisement. You have to also put the criteria and weighting in your advertisement, and if you're going to interview. We don't have a lot of engineering projects in our current program right now, but I just want to put that out there so that if we move one in, you're aware of it. So IDOT's PPI form, those can be updated at any time a project changes, even if it's just a letting date or a cost change, local costs. The initial PPI gets it in IDOT's database, gets the scope of the project, location and termini. IDOT verifies that the project is in the TIP. They can then issue state job number and federal project numbers, make sure that the funding sources are there. PPIs need to come through the PLs, so they need to be submitted to myself and Joe, and then we will then send them on. Make sure you're always using the most recent form off IDOT's website. They do update that periodically. They don't tell us when they're doing that, so if you submit an outdated form, they will kick it back. So it's always good to make sure you're pulling it off their website each time. For every federally funded phase, you're going to need to do a local agency agreement between IDOT and the local agency to have those federal funds reimbursed. Again, make sure you're using the most current form. It's the BLR 5310. And then if you're using a consultant for engineering services, there'll be the BLR 5610 or 5611, depending on the phase of the project. The IDOT agreement process is a lengthy one. We've talked about this in the past. I'm sure most of you are aware, but the draft agreements get filled out and submitted to the planning liaisons, and then we submit them to IDOT. IDOT staff reviews them in District 1 and then sends them on to central office for review. Any corrections are made and then sent back to the local agency for them to sign it, take it through their board and sign it, whatever their process is. Then they send the locally executed agreements back to IDOT, wait a couple months, IDOT signs them, gets federal authorization, and then you can get notice to proceed. And right now we're seeing 9 to 12 months for this process. Although, we just had one that was tip the scales. I think it's our record in the council, but a phase 1 agreement took 20 months. So not ideal. Make sure you're planning for that. Typical delays, it doesn't come through the PL or it's submitted before your PPI is approved. The PPI, the agreement, and the TIP all need to match. We can't submit phase 2 agreements until there is design approval. You don't have exhibits, or it's not dated, the wrong resolution or scope, or the fund source changed. Another item to keep in mind when it comes to construction agreements, a lot of times we're not getting comments or corrections on the construction agreements back from IDOT until right before the letting or even after the letting. But IDOT issued a memo. It's been a couple years now, but they are still following it. But basically, you have to submit locally executed construction agreements to District 1. They need to be received 2 days prior to the service bulletin, the project being advertised for letting. Even if you have not gotten corrections or comments back from IDOT, execute the drafts and submit hard copies to IDOT to the district. They are not being flexible on this, so if your agreements are not in District 1 2 days prior to the service bulletin, they will push it to the next letting. And then CMAP's database has to be accurate for FHWA to authorize the funds for the federal funding to continue to flow through the region. It's one of the implementation arms of ON2 2050, the region's long-range plan. And it ensures that the region is constrained to our resources. Local PLs, Joe and myself are responsible for all the federally funded projects in Lake County. And then tip changes are approved by CMAP, and there's a schedule that's out as part of the IDOT letting schedule. And there's also CMAP has a master transportation schedule. So we need to make sure that the tip database is up to date. So I ran through that stuff pretty quickly. That's really the federal process. I think most people that are on here are familiar with it. But I do want to get into the program management and how we're going to manage our program of projects. It's really the most important part of this. You know, I don't anticipate this training taking a long time, but you know, active program management is how we're going to ensure that we can keep projects funded and make sure that we're spending our money each year. So there's a bunch of different things that go into that, and we're gonna kind of talk through all of them this morning. So first of all, just to define what we're talking about, the active program is a fiscally constrained list, multi-year list of projects. And right now that is federal fiscal year 2021 through 2025. The active program has to be in CMAP's TIP, and that all of the TIP updates to match our approved program were approved by this MPO policy committee earlier this month on October 14th. The first year, so right now, federal fiscal year 2021 is the current year and has obligation deadlines where the funding that is programmed in that year has to be spent by the end of the federal fiscal year, or September 30th of 2021, or we will lose it to the shared fund. The next 4 years, 2022 through 2025, are considered the out years. We also have a contingency list. The contingency list are the next highest ranked projects that we weren't able to include in our active program due to fiscal constraint. Projects that are on the contingency list, sponsors have to agree to keep them active and moving forward. It's not a guarantee of federal funds. And the contingency list expires at our next call for projects in 2022. So it's just for the next 2 years. But we need a list of projects that are moving forward that, should we have funding become available or a project on our active program slips, we have a list of projects available to obligate those funds so we don't lose them. So one of the most important things in the active program management process is quarterly status updates. Whether a project is on the active or the contingency list, we need to have quarterly status updates of the project. It'll include milestone dates for all phases, even phases that aren't being funded with council funds. Even if they're locally funded, we still need the milestone dates for those. And they have to be submitted by one of the designated project managers. They're required to be submitted in December, March, June, and September. So the first set of quarterly updates under this new project will be this December. As long as they are submitted any day in the month of December, they're considered on time. So I will send out a reminder with the form at the end of November to all the sponsors that are on our active and contingency list, and it will be due by the end of December. When we get these updates, council staff will update and republish the council program. We'll keep CMAP's TIP up to date, and then as necessary, we'll review and submit updated PPIs so IDOT is tracking these projects correctly. This is perhaps one of the most important slides of the presentation here. If we don't receive status updates from a project, the consequences are severe. These are regional rules that apply to all the councils for both the local programs and the STP shared fund. And we'll talk through this, but if you have a project with any phase programmed in the current fiscal year, so right now in federal fiscal year 2021, and we don't receive a status update, the project and all of its later phases will be moved out of the active program and put on our contingency list. Funds that are in CMAP's TIP will be moved to MYB, and it'll take a formal TIP amendment to move them back into our active program. If we don't receive a status update for projects that are in the out years, so 2022 through 2025, any of those project phases and all subsequent phases will be taken out of the active program and moved to the contingency list, and they would need to reapply for funding during the next call for projects. If you have a project on the contingency list, the project phase and all subsequent phases would be removed from the contingency program, and you would have to reapply in 2022 to get funding again. So again, these are regional rules. They apply to all of the councils throughout the region, as well as the city of Chicago. So just really want to emphasize that the consequences for not having the status updates in are very severe. This is to ensure that we are tracking projects correctly. And then all of the status updates are going to get uploaded to CMAP's TIP database. So CMAP and IDOT and FHWA will be able to see the current status of all the projects. And we're going to use these to, the goal is to identify problems in the process. And, we're not looking to be punitive for project sponsors. So if we start to see as a region that IDOT's agreement review process is taking longer, we can build in some flexibility for that into our obligation deadlines and make sure that if all we're waiting on is agreement approval, that those funds wouldn't be lost. So obligation deadlines are for the current year. So for this year, that's federal fiscal year 2021, which started October 1st. We have to obligate all the funds by September 30th. For phase 2, obligation is what we consider obligation is the executed phase 2 agreement with FHWA authorization, which is at the end of that 9 to 12 month review process. And for construction, it's federal authorization, which usually happens a couple weeks before the letting. So I want to just highlight IDOT's letting schedule and the lead times that are in that letting schedule. I know a lot of you have seen this before, and this is an old letting schedule, but it gets the point across. So let's look at the March letting here. And then if we slide all the way across the letting schedule, pre-final plans are due in September for a March letting. But it's not until the end of January that the feds authorize the money. And that is when, as I just mentioned, the funds are considered obligated. And so they would have met the obligation deadline. And then as we talked about before with the agreements being due before the service bulletin, in the case of the March letting, by January 29th, those locally executed agreements would need to be into District 1 in Schaumburg, where this project would be pushed to the next letting. So there's a lot of lead time and a lot of steps that go into this. Most people I'm aware, I know are aware of this, but it's important that we're all on the same page. So what happens if a project can't meet the obligation deadline? If we have a project that for whatever reason is currently programmed this year, but it's clear that they're not going to make the September 30th obligation. So that we have a couple options. We can reprogram the funds to a later year if we have room in a later year in our program. We can request a one-time 6-month extension. So if there is we have a very definitive reason why the project is going to be delayed, and we feel that, within the next 6 months after that, after the September 30th, the project will get to a letting, then we can request an extension, and then those funds will go to the next year with that project. The project could be moved to the contingency list, or the sponsor could decide to proceed at their own risk. But if they decide to proceed at their own risk and they don't hit the September 30th obligation deadline, then those funds would be taken away from the council, and we'll get into that in a little bit. And that project would be moved to our contingency list and have to reapply in the future. So there's quite a bit of risk to that. In addition to the 6-month extension of a phase, if we're talking about, especially when it comes to engineering agreements, if the only thing we're waiting on is IDOT approval of the agreement, and it has not happened at the end of the 6-month extension, there is some language in the regional rules that we would add an additional 3 months onto that to account for the IDOT review time. So if you've gotten your agreements in on time, in a reasonable time, and we're just waiting on IDOT approval, the idea is that you'd be held harmless here. Oh, and let me jump back real quick. So if it becomes clear, it's the March status updates that we're going to be looking at very closely to make sure that all projects that are in the current year will make the obligation deadline. Because by then you're going to be with that lead time into about pre-final plans for the end of the fiscal year lettings, and it'll be it should be pretty obvious if you're excuse me, not going to make that obligation deadline by the end of the fiscal year. And so we would then give sponsors a couple weeks after the March status updates are due to decide how to proceed if it's clear that an obligation deadline isn't going to be met. And then we would need the sponsor to inform council staff so we can reprogram if available, or request an extension, however we need to proceed with that phase of the project. So for reprogramming, we can reprogram a project at any time. We don't have to wait until there's status updates. If something changes, we can do it at any time. The important thing is to remember that we have to maintain fiscal constraint in each year of the program at all times. So we can't move a project to 2023 without moving something else out of 2023 or making room for it. We have to be fiscally constrained at all times. If we move a project up from an out year into the current year, the obligation deadline of September 30th still holds, regardless of when in the fiscal year we move it up. And it might be necessary that we have to move other phases out of the current year to accommodate something that's ready to go. And the program, the regional rules require that we publish an updated program prior to making tip changes. And so the way our rules are written in the council, staff can make those updates and publish them to our website and then submit the tip changes. So we can do that with some expedited processing. This is also one of the most important slides in the presentation of how we have a hierarchy in our methodology for reprogramming projects. This is all assuming that we have funding available and we have multiple projects that can all use that funding. We would have a hierarchy to determine which project would be advanced first. So first we would look for cost changes for projects that are already obligated before we would look for cost increases for phases that are in our current year. We would look to accelerate construction phases from out years of the program before we would look to bring up engineering phases. We would look to accelerate construction phases in the contingency program before bringing in engineering phases. And these mirror what the CMAP STP shared fund hierarchy looks like. So I did want to pause here real quick and pull up our council program. Because as I mentioned last week at our transportation committee, we do have some available funding in fiscal year 2021. We have $441,824 that's currently unprogrammed. And so we will use this hierarchy to determine how we reprogram those funds. So we do have two projects that are on the November letting that are both considered obligated right now. The federal funds have been authorized. The letting is next Friday, and so we can see if additional funding might be needed there. We also have a project on the January letting and the March letting. If it ends up that we can't use any of these, if none of these projects need additional federal funding, we can look to the out years, as the hierarchy says, to see are there ready to go projects that we can pull up. The important thing to remember is that this available funding, as I mentioned before, is subject to the obligation deadline. So we can't reprogram it in a later year. We have to find something that can use it this year. It might mean that a later year then has an available balance that we could then bring something from the contingency list into a later year, or add some additional funding to an out year project to cover that available balance. But that money is for federal fiscal year 2021. And so we can't just move it to a later year. It is subject to obligation deadlines. Let me switch back to the presentation. So this is the process that we're going to use. And then I'm gonna follow this process over the next couple of weeks, and then in January, bring a recommendation to the Council Transportation Committee about how to reprogram that available funding. But we do have this process in our approved methodology and rules. If we don't spend our funds, so this $440,000 that we have right now, let's use that as the example. If we are not able to find something that can spend it this year, those funds at the end of the year will not be carried over in our program. They'll be redistributed to the STP shared fund at CMAP. If we have a phase of a project that is granted that 6-month extension, then the funds would be carried over with that project. It's only if they're unprogrammed. Or, and we'll get into the ways we could the other ways we could possibly carry that over. But if we have a project that needs a little bit more money at the beginning of the next federal fiscal year, we could possibly carry it over into 2022, but it would expire on March 31st. And if that project that we were planning to use it on got delayed beyond that, those funds would then be swept out of our program to the STP shared fund. So there are a couple exceptions to that. So if a project is granted an extension, then the funds would be carried over into the next fiscal year. If we get low bids on the projects that we have in our 21 program, we won't lose the money, that the difference between what we had programmed and what a lower bid came in at. Those obligation remainders, when we get a favorable bid, those can be carried over to the next fiscal year, and then we can use our active reprogramming to, as we mentioned, to assign those funds. Or if the unobligated funds were unprogrammed, if we got to the end of the fiscal year and we still had this $441,000, there are kind of two scenarios where we could carry that over. We have a project that's ready to go at the end of this year, but the $441,000 isn't enough to cover the cost of the project. But if it were to move into 2022, the $440,000 plus our new pot of money in 2022 would be enough to get that project funded. Then we could carry those funds over for that project. But again, they expire March 31st. Or we don't have any projects at the end of this year, but we have something that is ready to go at the beginning of next year, and we can demonstrate that, then we could carry those funds over. But if we don't have things that are ready to go and we can't demonstrate that they're ready to go, then we would lose those funds to the shared fund. So cost increase requests in our council rules, they can't be guaranteed. They're based on if we have funding available. The council rules state that we can grant a cost increase a maximum of 20% above what was originally programmed, up to our federal cap in our methodology. If we don't have funds available when a cost increase, if it comes in at the beginning of the fiscal year, then that project would have to wait until April, until after those March status updates, so we can see, is there going to be a project in our council that's getting delayed out of the current year, where then we could use those funds that are coming available to pay for the cost increase. Projects have to be ready to go in the current year. And for projects that are in our out years, up to 20% cost increase above what's programmed could be requested during the next call for projects. There is a process where councils can access any funds that are available in the shared fund. So if either we lose funds to the shared fund or other councils lose funds, those are funds that can be accessed by any of the councils if we have projects that are ready to go. But we can only do that once all of our funds for the year have been obligated. So it's not enough for us at the beginning of the year to say, everything's programmed, we're going to spend all our money this year. We actually have to get those projects out the door and have the funds authorized. Once they are, if we still have projects that are ready to go, then we could request additional funding from CMAP, from the STP shared fund. Those will be on a first ready, first funded basis, but the project has to be ready to spend the money. CMAP staff will then determine if shared funds are available and can approve those requests once they verify from IDOT that the project is truly ready to go. So we will plan to use this process, this year. we have all of our projects, as I showed in our program for 2021. The last project we have is on the March letting. So by the end of February, our council funds should be authorized. So if we have other projects in later years or even the contingency list that are ready to go, we can then request additional funding from CMAP. There's no guarantee that we're going to get additional funds, especially this year. I think it's going to be pretty difficult, as you all know. The region essentially ran out of money in federal fiscal year 2020, which pushed back a lot of projects into our new program. And so there really wasn't funds carried over from previous years. So I don't know that we're going to be able to access additional funds this year, but I think we will in the future. So that's really the bulk of it. There are a couple other things here, but that's how we're going to manage our program. GATA periodic reporting is required for all state and federally funded projects. It's required at least quarterly, although your agency may have a different protocol based on a risk assessment from IDOT. This bullet point in the slide is from a year and a half ago and is very much applicable today. It's still very much an evolving process that everyone is learning together. But you're supposed to use IDOT's BOBS form, Bureau of Business Services 2832 for the quarterly reporting. And those reports are required even if there's been no project activity since the last report. My understanding in talking to county finance folks and other municipal folks is, we are doing these quarterly reporting regularly, every quarter as we're supposed to, diligently sending them on to IDOT. And as far as I know, I have not heard of anyone who's received any sort of feedback from IDOT on whether the forms are being filled out correctly, if there need to be changes. Right away, obviously, is a critical path item in our projects. The council program doesn't pay for right away, it's a local responsibility. But as we talked about, if we don't spend our funds at the end of the year, we lose them. And so as part of the council rules, right away must be certified by June 30th of the preceding federal fiscal year for construction to be programmed in that next year. So let's use this year as an example. So for federal fiscal year 2022, which starts on October 1st of 2021, you would have to have, for all of our projects that are targeting construction in federal fiscal year 2022, right away needs to be certified by IDOT by June 30th of 2021 for us to continue to program the construction in federal fiscal year 2022. If right away is not certified by June 30th, we will reprogram the construction funds out of 2022 to a later year and look to pull something else up. This way, we're not starting the obligation deadline for those projects that don't have right-of-way cleared, and we're not putting the cost of a construction project at risk, hoping that right-of-way comes through. For projects that are in the later years of our program, each call for projects, the sponsors will need to send a letter from the mayor or village manager confirming that their commitment to the project. They don't need to be reapplied and re-ranked at a future call. They could ask to reprogram the project. And then I don't think we have any projects currently that fall into this, but if we were to fund a project or in our program in an out year that has not started phase one, they have until the next call for projects to start their phase one And if they don't, then it would be pulled out of our active program, all the subsequent phases, and they would need to reapply. Again, that's a regional rule to make sure that projects get started. So I'm wrapping it up here. Federal funding comes with strings. We're trying to balance all of the programs, make sure projects get done. So everybody involved has to do their part. Communication is critical. And despite all of these rules, the goal really is to spend every dollar every year and get these projects out the door. I know there are a lot of rules and procedures, and it may not seem like that, but that really is what we're trying to do. So council staff, we're here. You know, we can set up a kickoff meeting with IDOT, discuss these active program management rules. If you have questions about paperwork or processing, funding or CMAP questions, both myself and Joe's contact information is here on this slide. And these slides will get posted on our website as well. So in closing, please, please, please communicate with us. And as I mentioned, you know, project readiness is the most important thing. That hierarchy is only if we have multiple projects that are ready to go. Otherwise, you know, where your project falls on the contingency list, where your project ranked, where your project is programmed in the active program even, is far less important if it's ready to go. If it's ready to go, we will do everything we can, try to access additional funds, reprogram it to an earlier year to make sure we're spending all of our council funds. And so that's all I have for today. If there are questions, I am happy to try to answer questions. All right. Well, hearing none, I will say thank you for coming today. We're going to post the recording of this on our website. The slides will be posted on our website.
Hey, Mike, I did have one question. I don't know if you saw it in the chat about the GATA reporting.
Yes.
This is Wally from Lincolnshire. Do you know when we need to start accounting for those funds on the GATA reports that are, you know, obviously the funds are in future years?
Mm-hmm.
Or is that a question for my finance director?
I don't have a solid answer. I don't know. We have, I know at Lake County DOT, we have started submitting them. I wouldn't say years in advance, but before a project, you know, if it's, I guess, within 6 months of a letting, we've started submitting those.
Okay.
I don't know if that's the right answer, but that's what we've started to do.
Okay, that's helpful. Thanks.
Mike, this is Dan Brinkman. Quick question.
Mm-hmm.
Has there been any discussion with Bureau of Land Act about certifying right-of-way for projects that may not be let for 9 months? It always seems like that's a race to the end. And I'm just curious to make sure that their review process, or at least they're aware that there's going to be projects in Lake County trying to get certification for something that might not be let for 6 to 9 months when they're focused on, you know, well, project and a letting in a week, still trying to get certification.
Yeah.